Oh, there we go. Okay, hi.
Okay, thank
Good,
you.
good.
Let's see if I can manage to share my screen now. One sec. Can you all see this? Good. So, welcome. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I wanted to thank Charles for being such a leader and putting this together year after year. I think it's really important for members of this community to have the opportunity to connect and talk about issues that go beyond just the day-to-day, hour-to-hour work that certainly that school counselors are doing in their respective institutions. So wanted to give you just a little bit of background about me. I was thinking about it today in terms of a seat at the table. I've had, I'm looking at a pentagonal table, and I have had a seat on three sides of it so far. I've been an applicant, as you can see, 3 times. I've been an admission officer. I was on the board of admission at Brown for several years. I am now an independent educational consultant, and I am a parent about to be going through this process. I have sophomore twins. I have not yet had the pleasure of being a school counselor. I'm hoping that that may come down the line. Today, what I really wanted to talk about is this past year and this coming year, specifically in relation to COVID-19 and how it has changed the landscape for us in so many ways. Some of the ways are obvious. For instance, standardized testing was impossible for part of last year, and it has changed things significantly going forward, maybe not as significantly as some of us hope. Schooling has been affected both in terms of transcripts and the way students are assessed, and also in terms of teachers' ability and school counselors' ability to write letters of recommendation for students that they know virtually much more than they know in person. There have been shifts in terms of extracurricular and summer opportunities for students as well. And what I had expected to see, and what I think I did see to a pretty wide extent this past year, is a rebalancing of the different components of an application. The transcript remains at the top of the heap, but I think that, as I said, it's been understood a little bit differently for students that were taking classes remotely. There were changes in many cases in systems of grading, as well as ways of um, um, giving students assignments and watching them do their work. The essays have become more important. I think that with the addition of the COVID-19 essay this year, that made it more possible for admission officers to hear directly from students about their experience and how they handled it, about which more later. Test scores are important, but because so many schools this past year went test optional, there was a lot of uncertainty about how that would affect, and a lot of hope about how that would affect applications. In other words, leveling the playing field a little bit. I mentioned recommendation letters, activities, honors, even interviews were shifted. Interviews are not the most important part of the college application process, but in a year when so many things were a little bit off track, having the opportunity to do a virtual interview with an alum from schools that you were interested in, for the schools that do that, was also, I think, useful and important, and something that admission officers paid a bit of attention to, maybe more than usual. Standardized testing is I think, maybe the major change that we've seen. Most schools, if not all, last year went either test optional or test blind, as you know. And that in itself changed the weighting of application components, but I would argue that it did not change them as much as you might think. There were huge numbers of students that decided to go all out and apply to schools that might have been outside the zone of schools that might be expected to admit them. They took a chance, figuring that if the test score wasn't going to be counted, the other components of their application would carry more weight. What we've seen is that students who submitted standardized test scores, of course, first of all, were generally only submitting them if they were happy with their scores. And so students who either would have retested, or students who didn't have a chance to test at all, were not in that group. But the students who were able to put forward their tests tended to do much better in terms of results, in terms of the number of schools to which they were admitted and the level of selectivity in some cases. I think that a lot of us believed that qualitative assessment tools such as recommendation letters from teachers and school counselors and essays would take on a more important role. But we have seen some changes. We're seeing, of course, that the SAT and the ACT have dropped their essay component, and the SAT subject tests are no more. In exchange for that, we're seeing an increase in APs, and that's changing teaching in some of the classrooms. So I would argue that quantitative assessment tools continue to be important, but which ones they are is what's shifting. As you know, again, last year, cancellations, and there was some at-home testing. Some of the students I work with are not from the US, and for them, in many cases, it meant taking the exam at very odd hours, the AP exams at very odd hours, and that is continuing this year. For students who are based in the US, that's not so much of an issue, but there are choices about when a student can take an AP exam and under what circumstances, so at school versus at home. I would argue that all the changes that have come about have led to new questions from admission officers. I think they're thinking about the admission process a bit differently. And the questions I've posted here give you an idea of the additional questions admission officers are asking. I can tell you that admission officers very much see their role as one of creating community, creating a community. And so they're balancing bringing in students who maintain the identity of the institution with bringing in students who offer some diversity and some change into it. And this question of adversity and opportunity gives a lot of students who might not fit into that first category the opportunity to be heard in a new way. So I've been actually really impressed with what admission officers have been thinking about in terms of how the students have handled this very, frankly, bizarre situation over the past year or two. I want to switch gears a little bit and give you some suggestions on how the students you work with can make the most out of this summer. And some of these things are obvious. You know that a lot of students will be doing some form of test prep, whether it's through Khan Academy or a private organization or an individual tutor. You know that you hope that they'll be working on application essays through the summer so that it doesn't all bunch up into the fall of senior year. You hope as well that they're all doing substantive research on colleges, and that research not only gives them information about the schools to which they might apply, but also helps them understand themselves and their goals better so that they can put together a list of schools that reflects their interests, their abilities, their challenges, and their goals. What I really want to focus on, though, is meaningful interest development. Interest development can take place in a lot of different ways. The three that I think are most relevant for students would be academic, extracurricular, and pre-professional. Many of the opportunities that were not available to students this past summer are beginning to come back, and I'm going to use the word online, but I don't necessarily mean online in a computer sense, are beginning to become available again. So that there are some academic summer programs that are going to be run in person, and there are many others that will remain online, but be available to students. In terms of extracurricular opportunities, tennis camp or an opportunity to do volunteer work over the summer, same thing. Some of those are beginning to come back online, and over the course of the summer, I think we'll see a continued opening. Pre-professional opportunities like internships are, I believe, primarily remote at this point, but there are other ways that students can explore their interests and can do so in a way that will be useful to them in the application process as well as in their own development. I have a couple of examples I wanted to just run by you. One is for somebody who's interested in computer science. It may seem obvious for them to do something like a coding competition, but they could also think about designing their own app and using their skills in a way that will help them respond to some piece of the COVID pandemic. For instance, I worked with a student this past year who didn't actually know a lot about computer science. He was interested in entrepreneurship, but he did a lot of volunteer work as a tutor at his school. And it was at his school, but it was for middle schools in the area. He got really worried about the students that he had been working with who didn't have access to tutoring during COVID, during remote learning. And so he got together with a friend who knew something about computer science. They put together an app. They designed it, they developed it, they marketed it to their school and the middle schools in their district. And that was a really nice way for him to do something that was constructive, that was giving back to his community, and that was also showing colleges an example of his entrepreneurship, an example of his motivation and his abilities. Remote internships, I've mentioned already. There are research programs online, such as Pioneer Academics. It's a bit late for students to be applying to most of those, but there are some that are still open. And the opportunity to do research in a field like computer science or like chemistry and so on, for some students will be a really compelling alternative to in-person academic summer programs. Then, of course, I also recommend that students get involved in some of the free courses that are available through sites like edX and Coursera, which gives them an opportunity to learn more about their field of interest, again, to show colleges about that interest, but also it gives them something to write about in some of their essays that's a little more substantive than just, I like computer science and I play a lot of computer games. Taking a different tack, remote interest development for somebody in the humanities. If you have a student who's really excited about art, he or she can be using summer as an opportunity to put together an art portfolio, so that if they're planning to apply to an art school or they're planning to major in studio art at a liberal arts college, for instance, they have something already available to them that they can submit as part of their application, and that can strengthen their candidacy. I'm going to jump to the third option here, curated interest-based reading list. I think students sometimes forget that reading about their interests is also a really substantive thing to do. And writing about what you've read gives you something to share with admission officers. In some cases, that can be really useful in, again, establishing the degree of your interest. And admission officers do tend to be excited about students that have that intellectual curiosity. So I have gone through all this rather quickly, but I do just want to say, I feel that although COVID-19 did level the playing field in some ways, I don't think it really did so in a long-term way that some of us may have hoped. Scrambled testing, yes, but colleges are continuing to, for the most part, receive tests from students who would like to submit them. There are online learning opportunities. Many of those, are free or low cost. There are extracurricular activities that have been, let's say, leveled, that have not been available to students over the past year and a half. And so students really need to be creative in finding ways to fill those gaps. My argument would be that the way that applicants use their time, have used their time over the past year and a quarter, let's say, and how they do that over the summer, it's an opportunity for admission officers to see, to learn what those students value, how they face a challenge, how they understand themselves in the world. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions. Charles, you're muted.
Thank you. Once again, if you have questions, just please unmute yourself and or post it in the chat. Caroline, I do have one actually. You had mentioned that there's crazy high admission or applications being submitted, but crazy low acceptances. Do you have any thoughts on what's going on behind the scenes there?
Yeah, at first I should specify that I mean that that's the case at more selective institutions rather than less selective institutions. In fact, a number of schools are starting to close their doors. Smaller liberal arts colleges and institutions that don't have huge endowments have really struggled to find enough students. And part of that is due to a demographic shift that's coming our way. But in terms of the huge increases at some of the most selective schools, a lot of that really has to do with students saying, hey, I don't have to submit my standardized test scores. My grades are terrific. My extracurriculars are great. I know my teachers are going to say positive things about me and I'm going to write some wonderful essays. I'm throwing my hat in the ring. And so that happened this year. Will it happen again in the next year or two? It may, but I think people are paying very close attention to what happened this year. And so I'm hoping there will be some balancing of that and there won't be quite the crazy high numbers that there were this past year.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Sorkin while we're here? Okay, we'll wind down off of that. Thank you very much for helping us out and participating.